All right, so we need to talk about the integument. The integument is the skin. And we know from the last chapter that the skin is our dry membrane, and it's called a cutaneous membrane. So we know that membranes are made up of at least 2 tissue types, and the skin is made up of an epithelial tissue, and it is sitting on top of connective tissue. The epithelial tissue we call the epidermis. And the epidermis is made up of stratified squamous epithelium. And you should know by now that that stratified squamous epithelium is keratinized. So it contains the protein keratin that makes skin tough. It makes it kind of hard. It makes it protective. Okay, it makes your nails really hard. Your hair is kind of hard. All right. The connective tissue creates the dermis. And of course, the epidermis sits on top of the dermis. So the epidermis itself is made up of several layers. These layers are called stratum. And I'm kind of try to draw these out a little bit. All right. So the first layer, and we're just talking about the epidermis right now, is a layer of cells and it's 1 cell layer thick. And this layer here is called the stratum basale. So kind of basal, so the beginning. So this layer, again, is 1 cell layer thick. And remember that the whole epidermis is stratified squamous epithelia. But these cells look a little cuboidal. But you should know that. That's part of stratified squamous epithelium. The cells won't look really like squamous cells until you get more towards the apical side. These cells in the stratum basale are going to be keratinocytes. And these cells are little cells, they're very mitotic. And basically, each one of these cells is going to divide, and one of those cells is going to stay where it is so that it can divide again. We can keep the stratum going. And the other cell is going to start to take a trip, and it's going to start to take a trip this way. Okay? Another cell type that is in here, put these sort of like this here. So this other cell type that's sporadically in here is called a melanocyte. Melanocytes secrete melanin, and it provides pigment to the skin. Okay, it also provides a little bit of a SPF, okay, to the skin, so a sun sort of protection thing. The melanin will come out in these little like bubbles, and they will come out and gather. This melanin will gather around keratinocytes on the surface of the keratinocyte that's facing towards the sun, facing towards the environment or the apical side of the epidermis. And that helps to coat those nuclei so that they're protected from the UV light, UV rays. All right, so these cells, these keratinocytes, the ones that are moving up, when they move out of the stratum basale, they enter another layer. And this layer, just kind of do it like that. So this layer here is called the stratum spinosum. And in this layer, the cells are moving up into this layer, and they're starting to mature. So the cells, the keratinocytes, are maturing. And they are starting to make and fill up with keratin. So starting the process of filling with keratin. So in case you were wondering, these cells are dying. Okay, so they are on their way to being dead cells. Now in here, they're maturing and they're fine, and even some of them might even go through mitosis in this layer, but they are maturing. They're starting to they're making keratin within there and starting to fill with keratin. As they're doing that, they get up to here, they're getting full of keratin, and when they enter the next layer, what color should I use? So the next layer here is called the stratum granulosum. And as they start to go into the stratum granulosum, they're starting to make lipids, these little lipid granules. And as they're building up these lipid granules, when they get up to the next layer, as they start to move up to go into the next layer, they start to barf out these lipid granules. Okay? The next layer, and this is a thick skin, is a small layer called the stratum lucidum. And this is where they're dying now. So in the stratum lucidum, they're barfed out their lipid granules, and they're basically dying here and getting packed together. By the time they get to the last layer, so the last layer up here, this layer here is the stratum corneum. And the stratum corneum is the biggest layer, and it's basically a bunch of dead keratinocytes that are stacked together like bricks with mortar, where the lipid granules are like the mortar and the cells are the bricks. And that's what makes the skin, the epidermis, very protective. Right? It makes it basically waterproof. Because of those lipid granules and then the keratin, and it makes it very strong. Okay, so that's whole thing is the epidermis. We just talked about here. to there is the epidermis. So is the epidermis vascular? Does it have any vessels in it? Have I talked about any vessels that could be in it? No, it is not vascular. It is an epithelial tissue. It's stratified squamous epithelial tissue, so it is avascular. So these cells down here in the stratum basale, they're dividing, so they've got to be getting some nutrition somewhere, and they get it from the dermis. So the dermis is down here. And there are two layers of the dermis. The first layer is a very small, thin layer of areolar connective tissue, and that layer is called the papillary layer. Under it, which is most of it down here, is the reticular layer. And I'm sorry that it's reticular, but that's the name of it. The reticular layer is dense, irregular connective tissue, and the papillary layer is areolar connective tissue. All right, the reticular layer and the papillary layer, these are vascular layers. This is connective tissue. Areolar connective tissue is very vascular. The dense irregular connective tissue is vascular. And actually here in these little bumps, I didn't do this just because it looked kind of cool. I did it because that's how it looks. There's little bumps here, and in the tops of these bumps are capillary beds. And that helps to feed this layer here. So there's capillary beds. There's also some cells here. And there are cells in that layer that are receptor cells. Just kind of make them like that. So these are nervous system receptor cells, all right? And these are called Meissner's corpuscles. These are touch receptors. In the epidermis actually has some receptors as well. And these receptors are right on the border here. All right, they're right on the border here. And these are called Merkel's discs. And these are also touch receptors. You're going to see pretty soon when we talk about receptors that your sense of touch contains a whole bunch of different types of receptors. All right, another type of cell that you'll see in the dermis are these cells that are immune system cells. And they look like little starfish. They're called dendritic cells. And they tag and eat pathogens. So they take in bacteria and stuff like that. And they help to initiate the immune response. So they turn on immune response, and they tag pathogens. Okay, so they're very important, and they eat those pathogens. Actually, they eat them, and they present them to the nervous system, or excuse me, the immune system to be cleared. Okay, so they are phagocytic cells. Okay, so those are basically the cells that you're going to see in the skin. Those are the layers. You need to know the layers of the epidermis, the layers of the dermis, okay, and how they kind of function there. There's going to be other receptors in here in the dermis. There's one in particular that you'll see that are big and they look like lollipops. And those are called Pacinian corpuscles, and that's another touch receptor. Okay, so there's all kinds of different cells in there. So please go through that. Go through your PowerPoint that shows all of this and make sure you know all the layers of both of those. That dermis sits on top of another layer called the hypodermis, which is a bunch of fat cells. It is not part of the skin. It is adhered to the muscle beneath, so it just helps to anchor the skin to that underlying tissue. All right, that's about it for skin. So make sure you go through all of that, and that's it.